Hello, my friends. And I want to lay out in one coherent argument where we actually are, starting with a war crime in the Caribbean, that the Trump administration is trying very hard to pretend is just a political inconvenience, and ending with why Russia is on the cusp of a decisive strategic victory in Ukraine and a fundamental reshaping of the European security order. Let's begin with the boat strike. The facts as they've emerged are grim. A U.S. strike on a vessel allegedly tied to a Venezuelan narcotics cartel, a first attack that disabled the boat, survivors in the water, and then a second deliberate strike that killed those survivors. The political handlers in Washington tried their usual game. The Secretary of Defense, in reality behaving like a Secretary of War, first claimed ignorance, dismissed it as fake news, insisted nothing had happened. Then, less than 24 hours later, the White House podium admitted it had happened. That leaves you with only two options. Either he was lying on Sunday, or he is so incompetent that he somehow did not know that a second strike had taken place. No serious person believes the latter. And either way, you are now staring straight at the 1996 U.S. War Crimes Act, which says that grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions can result in life imprisonment or death. That is not a talking point. It is black letter law. If the President of the United States, the Secretary of War, and the Admiral in charge authorized or tolerated, kill them all, rules of engagement against shipwrecked survivors, they are staring at potential capital crimes. I want people to understand something basic about the law of war. Intent matters, and certain orders are inherently unlawful. When a president declares publicly that he wants to kill all the narco-terrorists, that he has no problem with killing them, that he wants them dead and will kill, he is broadcasting intent. When a Secretary of War goes to Quantico, stands in front of 800 flag officers, and brags that he no longer does silly rules of engagement, that the gloves are off, that we are a lethal fighting force, and we kill, and then appears to have issued guidance that everyone on board certain ships is to be killed, to send a message. You are not in some murky gray zone. You are in the realm of an unlawful order U.S. Military doctrine is crystal clear. You cannot issue an order of no quarter. You cannot say kill them all in a way that removes protected status from people hors de combat out of the fight and expect subordinates to obey. The correct answer from any professional officer confronted with such an order is no, sir. I reject this order in writing as a flagrant violation of the law of war. If I obey, I will be criminally liable under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The president cannot lawfully punish you for refusing to carry out an unlawful order. But what we have today is a political leadership that has corrupted the mindset of the officer corps to the point that some of them no longer know or pretend not to know the difference between killing and murder. Let me be very clear about where I'm coming from. I was trained to kill, and I was very good at it. My job as a young Marine officer was to close with and destroy the enemy through fire and maneuver. I was, by design, a heartless and ruthless son of a bitch in combat terms. If you went to war against me and my fellow Marines in that era, we would have slaughtered you without hesitation, because that's what we were trained and prepared to do. But we were also rigorously trained in the law of armed conflict. We do not murder. If you have a gun and you are an active, lawful threat, you die. I will sleep like a baby after killing you. If you pose a lawful threat to the United States, I will obey every lawful order to butcher you and your comrades in arms. But if you are out of the fight, wounded, shipwrecked, or surrendering, you are protected. The notion that our military somehow forgot how to kill and needed some loudmouth politician in a suit to come in and teach them to be lethal by lifting constraints is obscene. Our military has always known how to kill. The problem is not a lack of lethality. The problem is the political leadership and parts of the special operations culture drifting into an ethos of murder. This isn't an abstract legal seminar. We've been here before. In the Second World War, submariners from multiple navies, American, German, Japanese, were filmed and photographed machine gunning survivors in the water after sinking merchant ships. People in the water, clinging to wreckage, begging to be rescued, were casually mowed down as sport, as revenge, or as a crude form of terror. After the war, some of those submarine officers were arrested, tried, and executed for murder. That practice was so prevalent that when the Geneva Conventions were updated in 1949, the maritime issue was explicitly addressed. Once a ship is sunk and the crew is in the water, they are hors de combat. They are out of the fight. They cannot be attacked. They are to be rescued or at least not harmed. Period. It does not matter if they are naval personnel, merchant mariners, smugglers, or narco-terrorists. It does not matter if the conflict is classified as international, non-international, or some hybrid law enforcement operation. Once they are in the water and incapable of fighting, they are protected persons. That was reaffirmed in the 1977 additional protocols and incorporated into the U.S. Law of War Manual. There are no exceptions, none. Hit a ship, see people in the water, and then intentionally strike them again to finish them off? That is a textbook war crime. The timeline only makes it worse. We're not talking about a fleeting fog of war situation where a helicopter pilot in the heat of the moment misidentifies a threat. By the Secretary's own statements, he was present for the first strike and then claims he departed, and hours later a second strike was ordered. That means someone sat, watched video, deliberated, and then chose to kill people who were clearly no longer a threat. That is premeditation. That is murder. And it's happening in the same political environment where the administration is busy attacking what they call the seditious six. Lawmakers who had the nerve to suggest that officers should disobey unlawful orders. The irony is staggering. Those six were right. The men now trying to paint themselves as defenders of the military are the ones openly broadcasting a kill-them-all ethos that places officers like Admiral Bradley in the dock while they pretend their own hands are clean. Now, we need to talk about the culture that produced someone like Bradley. He's not some innocent technocrat who climbed the ranks in a clean institution and suddenly found himself in a moral quandary. He comes out of SEAL Team 6, and that unit, as it has evolved in the post-9/11 era, has become culturally a criminal organization. I'm not saying there aren't honorable individuals inside it. I am saying that as an institution, it has normalized murder. Red Team Canoes people shooting a man in the head after he is dead to split his skull as a calling card is not heroism, it's mutilation. Men have bragged publicly about canoeing Osama bin Laden's corpse, even though they weren't the ones who killed him. We have accounts of SEALs attacking wedding parties in Afghanistan, machine gunning survivors in ditches, planting weapons on bodies to cover up unlawful killings, and doing it with a sense of impunity. When someone from that culture rises to flag rank and is then handed an unlawful kill them all directive from the political echelon, it is not surprising that he accepts it without serious resistance. He has been conditioned over an entire career to blur the line between lawful killing and murder. The rot goes beyond special operations. Scroll through American social media and you will see former officers and NCOs boasting about acts that amount to war crimes, treating the deliberate killing of non-combatants as a joke or a mark of toughness. You get figures like Buzz Patterson, a man who carried the nuclear football for Bill Clinton and now parades around online as if that made him Patton, implying that it is acceptable to kill people outside the bounds of the law of war. He's echoed by people like Robert O'Neill and a whole ecosystem of veterans who spent 20 years in the so-called global war on terror, fighting small skirmishes, kicking in doors, and then convincing themselves that any restriction on their behavior is weakness. Meanwhile, the generation that trained for large-scale World War III level combat in the 1,980 seconds, the people who understood that discipline and adherence to law are critical when you are dealing with mass violence on a continental scale, are either retired or sidelined. The ethos has shifted from apolitical professionalism to politicized tribal loyalty and casual lawlessness. And that politicization matters. When I joined the military in 1979, I wasn't a fan of Jimmy Carter, but he was my president and commander-in-chief. When Ronald Reagan came in, I liked him more. When George H.W. Bush came in, I went to war under him. Then Bill Clinton took office, and I had no use for him personally. It didn't matter. My allegiance was to the Constitution and to the lawful chain of command, not to any party or personality. That changed under Clinton and then accelerated under George W. Bush when purges of officers began based on perceived political loyalty. Suddenly, loyalty to the party, the president, and the ideological project replaced loyalty to the constitutional framework. Combine that with 20 years of expeditionary wars fought far from home, with loose oversight and a permissive ideological narrative, we're fighting evil, and you get exactly what we see now. Officers who no longer know how to say no to an unlawful order, who treat presidential rhetoric as a substitute for law. Now, let's pivot to Ukraine and Russia, because that's the real geopolitical center of gravity. What the recent delegation to Moscow tells you, Kushner, Steve Witkoff, meetings with Putin, Ushakov, Dmitriev, is that Europe is out of the game. They don't matter anymore. There is no serious role left for people like Marco Rubio as special envoy, or for European capitals as decision makers. The United States is quietly conceding reality. Russia has won the war in Ukraine. That's not a moral judgment. It's a military and economic one. Ukraine is being given a grim choice: accept defeat and negotiate from a position of weakness, or keep fighting and be annihilated. Trump has said bluntly that if they continue, there won't be a Ukraine left. That is not hyperbole. Trump's strategic instinct, whatever you think of him personally, is to disentangle the United States from losing legacy commitments. NATO expansion, keeping Russia as the perpetual manufactured enemy in Europe, endless wars in the Middle East, and an inevitable collision with China over Taiwan all run counter to a Monroe Doctrine 2, zero vision, where Washington focuses on the Western Hemisphere and manages power projection more selectively. To pivot to Fortress America, you have to unwind these commitments. That means you cannot afford a forever war in Ukraine that drains resources, risks nuclear escalation, and yields no meaningful gain. So what do? You quietly move toward the European security architecture that Russia itself proposed in December 2021, a new framework that recognizes spheres of influence, calms the borderlands, limits NATO, and embeds economic interdependence as a security guarantee. Strip out the bureaucratic garbage that people like Keith Kellogg and Rubio added to the 28-point plan, and what you see underneath is exactly that: a blueprint for de-escalation, mutual trade, and a non-ideological settlement. On the ground, the war is already over in all but formalities. Ukrainian brigades exist on paper as 5,000-man formations, but in reality struggle to field 500 effectives. Battalions are the size of companies. Companies are the size of reinforced squads. You have elite formations, like the 25th Brigade and 38th Marine Brigade, reduced to about 1,000 starving men, trapped in a town whose name most Westerners can't even pronounce. Supplied only by drones and unmanned ground vehicles, the Russians have direct fire control over the supply routes, shoot down the drones, blow up the logistics robots. The wounded are left to rot in basements because evacuation is impossible. We saw the same horror in Pokrovsk. Cellars full of dead and dying Ukrainian soldiers that their own command had abandoned. When your government tells your best brigades, no, you may not break out, you must stay and fight to the death, and the rank and file realize they are literally being fed into the meat grinder for nothing, the will to resist collapses. Desertions skyrocket. Units walk away. Russia's stated objective of demilitarizing Ukraine is not a slogan. It is being implemented. Moscow has already signaled that it will accept only a tiny Ukrainian military post-war on the order of 50,000 to 60,000 lightly armed troops with no capacity to threaten Russia no NATO-trained neo-Nazi formations like Azov and Kraken, and no return to the fantasy of a 600,000, 800,000 man Ukrainian European army acting as a mercenary force for Brussels. To the victor go the spoils. If you want a large standing army, you must win the war. Ukraine has lost, and Moscow will enforce that loss in the structure of the post-war Ukrainian state. Corruption is the second pillar of Russian strategy. Western politicians pretend that Ukraine's corruption scandals are a sign of healthy democracy. That is delusional. Ukraine has been a sewer of corruption from day one, and Washington has been standing knee-deep in that sewage, perfectly happy as long as the money flowed to the right pockets. Congress couldn't even agree to an inspector general to track tens of billions in aid because too many people were enjoying the kickbacks. Zelensky governs by distributing contracts and cash to build personal constituencies. The Rada is a clearinghouse where parties divide the national economy into private fiefdoms. You get a contract to build fortifications that never materialize, pocket the money, buy your mistress a diamond necklace, get yourself a Porsche and a condo in Miami, and when the Russians break through the non-existent trenches, you shrug. That's Ukraine. Russia's goal is not simply to impose a new border. It is to dismantle that entire corrupt oligarchic system and replace it with structures that serve Russian strategic interests. That does not mean Russia is magically corruption-free. It means the future Ukrainian political economy will be designed to produce a parliament and a government aligned with Moscow, not Washington. And you cannot do that if you grant blanket amnesty to every war criminal and thief. This is why the amnesty language in the 28-point document is at best a temporary bargaining chip. The Russians may allow limited amnesties to facilitate an initial settlement, but they will not permanently protect the worst offenders. Denazification is not propaganda either. Horrific crimes have been committed by Ukrainian ultra-nationalists, especially in border regions like Kursk. Elderly civilians who could not flee were raped, hacked to death, mutilated by men wearing SS symbols and Nazi iconography. The Russians know who these people are. They will not be allowed to quietly retire in Lviv or Kiev. They will not be allowed to live in a post-war Ukraine that Russia dominates. Many will die in battle, others will flee abroad, and then find that part of Russia's normalization with the West involves extradition agreements for war criminals. If you shelter them, you will be expected to hand them over. All of this explains why Putin has refused to follow the advice of Western armchair warriors who demand decapitation strikes on Kyiv. A dramatic assassination of Zelensky might feel emotionally satisfying to some, but it would be strategically idiotic. It would cement the narrative of Russian barbarism, give Europe an excuse never to recognize the new borders, and lock in sanctions indefinitely. Instead, Putin is playing a far more sophisticated long game. He wants a settlement in which the West formally recognizes Russia's sovereignty over Crimea and the four new regions, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk, lifts sanctions and restores access to frozen Russian assets. He wants to turn what could have been a forever war into a decisive victory, followed by economic normalization that brings in hundreds of billions, if not trillions, in trade and investment. That long game includes the possibility of transforming Ukraine from a hostile buffer into the third sister in a union state with Russia and Belarus. There are serious people in Moscow and Minsk working toward that vision. A trilateral political economic integration that resolves the root cause of the conflict by fusing Ukraine's fate to that of Russia and Belarus. This is not about raising a flag over Odessa to satisfy nationalist pride. It is about structuring the post-war order so that the question of Ukrainian alignment is settled for generations. Territorial issues like Odessa and Mykolaiv can be resolved through referenda under conditions of Russian political dominance rather than through heavy-handed occupation that would keep Europe permanently hostile. That is why you do not see Russia marching on Kyiv to decapitate the regime. You see Russia grinding down the Ukrainian army, reshaping the political landscape, and preparing to win at the conference table what it has already won on the battlefield. Meanwhile, Europe has descended into a kind of hysterical madness. European leaders talk about Russia planning to attack them then in the same breath propose preemptive, hybrid, or even kinetic strikes on Russia. You now have NATO military committee figures musing about a preemptive attack when NATO, stripped of American capabilities, doesn't even have the aircraft, munitions, planning, infrastructure, or legal clarity to assemble a serious first strike package. Their own officials admit they don't know who would authorize it, under what legal basis, or which assets would carry it out. It's theater. Cyber? Aside from the United States, and to a lesser extent British GCHQ and a small Dutch capability, Europe is a cyber lightweight. Russia has infiltrated their systems and holds the upper hand in any prolonged cyber exchange. Hybrid operations? The British have already been doing that, planning and running drone attacks on Russian bases and the so-called Shadow Fleet using Ukrainian proxies and special operators from the Special Boat Service and MI6. Moscow knows exactly who is responsible. What makes this European bravado suicidal is the military math. Russia is reportedly producing on the order of 1,000 drones a day and using perhaps 300, 500 inches Ukraine. Do the arithmetic. The surplus drones are being stockpiled. There will come a day, if Europe insists on escalating, when Russia can darken the skies over Europe with swarms of drones and conventional missiles. There is no effective integrated air defense in place to stop a sustained barrage of that magnitude. New iterations of the Iskander system, extended range cruise missiles like the 9M729 adapted for the post-INF environment, and mass-produced loitering munitions mean there is not a square inch of industrial Europe that Russia cannot hit. Germany's industry could be wiped out in days. France, Britain, if they choose to play nuclear chicken, could find themselves staring at total devastation. And then the question arises, will an American president really trade Boston for a mid-sized Polish city if Europe provokes a nuclear exchange? Is Article 5 a suicide pact, or will Washington eventually acknowledge what should be obvious? If Europe insists on collective suicide, the United States is not obligated to jump off the cliff with it. On top of that, Europe has done its best to commit energy suicide. Brussels passes laws proclaiming that they will never again use Russian gas or oil, as if the laws of physics and economics can be amended by parliamentary vote. In reality, they were deeply dependent on Russian energy. They still are in structural terms, and they will crawl back to Russian supplies in one form or another because there is no viable alternative that allows them to remain competitive. Their bravado is theater. The underlying dependency is real. Then you get a leader like Macron pontificating about corruption in Russia, claiming that the only reason you don't hear about it is because there are no independent institutions investigating it. That is nonsense. Russia's been fighting a real, visible, often brutal anti-corruption campaign for years. Governors, deputy defense ministers, generals, and regional officials have been arrested, stripped in public of their medals and posts, and sent to prison. The partial mobilization of 300,000 men in 2022 inadvertently exposed the scale of corruption in some local military commissariats. Units that were supposed to have equipment, uniforms, and weapons discovered that funds had been stolen, stockpiles neglected, and readiness falsified. Putin's response was not to hide it, it was to arrest the offenders, remove them, and make examples of them. Not quietly, publicly. To understand this, you have to remember the catastrophe Putin inherited in 2000. The 1,990 seconds in Russia were a U.S.-engineered economic rape. Western advisors and Russian opportunists colluded to strip state assets, enrich a small group of oligarchs, and drive tens of millions into poverty. Putin could not simply nationalize everything overnight. He cut a deal. The oligarchs could keep what they had stolen, but henceforth they would pay taxes, invest inside Russia, employ Russians, and stop using the state as a pure extraction machine. Those who refused, like Khodorkovsky, were arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned on charges that were very real. Others fled and now work for Western intelligence using their stolen billions to fund operations against Russia from London and elsewhere. Over time, Putin has reduced Russia's dependence on these people and used Western sanctions to finish the job. By sanctioning the oligarchs and seizing their overseas holdings, the West effectively severed their economic value to the Kremlin. Putin responded by tightening capital controls, mandating reinvestment inside Russia, and using the crisis to spur domestic production. Is there still corruption? Of course. Russia is a large, complex state with huge flows of money and significant regional autonomy. But it is not the free-for-all of the 1,990 seconds, and Moscow is actively prosecuting corrupt officials in a way that puts many Western anti-corruption efforts to shame. I don't come to those conclusions from an office in Washington. I've spent weeks at a time in Russia this past year, August, October, and a 19-day stretch, immersing myself in the country, talking to economists, diplomats, military officers from general down to junior officers, as well as ordinary Russians in modest neighborhoods and provincial towns. I don't stay at the metropole and sip champagne with state media hosts. I stay at 3-star hotels, ride the subway, sit in kitchens, and listen. I read Russian language documents, use translation tools where needed, and crucially, I know enough of the culture and the system to put what I read into context. That's the difference between an intelligence approach and the typical Western Russia expert at Stanford or Georgetown who speaks beautiful Russian but hasn't bothered to engage with the actual country in years and filters everything through ideological prejudice. My goal is not to craft narratives. It is to get the ground truth as close as a human can. When I'm wrong, I don't blame bad sources. I look at my analytical framework, adjust my collection, and fix the error. That's how you do real analysis. Now, a lot of people in the West ask, if Russia is this strong and this determined, why didn't it intervene decisively in Ukraine back in 2014? The answer is that Russia wasn't ready. When Putin came to power, the Russian military was broken. The Chechen wars were fought primarily with blood and guts, not with a modern, integrated professional force. There was no real sophistication, no joint doctrine. They won in Chechnya through sheer brutality and improvisation, not through a system that could be scaled and applied elsewhere. The conscript-based Soviet legacy army was still in place in structure and mentality. Contracts, soldiers, professionals were only beginning to emerge, and many of them were tied up in Chechnya because you cannot fight that kind of war with unwilling conscripts.